Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Sarah Shreves from the University of Miami. I am the chair of this session, which is the Repository Rodeo Redux. This is the second time that we've had a panel like this. The first one was last year in Dublin. And we thought it was a really useful way to introduce the community, those of you who might be new to open repositories, to the range of repositories represented here. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. This will be, there will be a series of presentations from each representative of a repository for about 10 minutes, and then they're going to convene back into a panel and be able to answer any questions, and we'll have a microphone out. I do want to say that this session is being recorded, so when you do ask questions, please do use the microphone so they can be captured, or we'll try to repeat them back. The one other thing I wanted to mention was, before we got started, is that unfortunately we have a little bit of a scheduling mix-up, so Tibor will have to leave sort of early on, probably before the questions begin, but he will be around during the conference, so if you have questions about Invenio, I'm sure he'll be able to talk to you about them. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the panel.
Thank you. So good morning, my name is Tibor Simko and I work at CERN in the Department of Information Technology on the Invenio Digital Library Framework and on the reproducible research data analysis, which is, by the way, the talk I will have to attend to later in the morning. So what is Invenio? It's a Pythonic digital library framework. We are building components that enable everyone to build a custom digital library solution. So we are targeting several use cases, such as the integrated library system, institutional repository, multimedia archive, or research data. Examples of these each exist at CERN for various needs. Invenio is used also outside of CERN. We have been publishing source code since 2002 under GNU General Public License. So there is an example of several sites, how they customized the framework, which you can find on our showcase gallery. And now let me briefly mention the technology stack we are using from the point of view of a user hitting the system. So when a user accesses the website, we have in front the load balancer. Sometimes the access can be very numerous. For example, during the Higgs boson seminar in 2012, it was the busiest ever day in Invenio history. Some supporting Megra material were hosted on the CERN document server side. We have seen 7 million hits in a day. So HA proxy we are putting in front of all our applications. For the web front-end side, so we are using Twitter Bootstrap, CSS, jQuery technologies, publishing packages on the Node package managers, NPM, and moving this year also to AngularJS, which is a similar move that these days have been doing. So the new applications for the search and deposit are now published in Angular. Then on the backend of the web server, we are using Python with the Flask micro web development framework and Jinja templating language. The long-running task we offload to the Celery worker system. And for the queuing needs, we are using RabbitMQ, caching needs Redis, for the database, SQL Alchemy object relational mapper with essentially PostgreSQL database on the backend. And for all information retrieval needs, we are using Elasticsearch. Files are stored in any kind of file system. So at CERN, we are using EOS, which is an open source distributed storage object system developed especially for use in physics, supporting X-Ruby, custom protocols, but it's a little bit like a Ceph, if you know. And other commercial and non-commercial systems can be plugged in as well. A little bit about the community. So Invenio is developed mostly at CERN, but also used and contributed to from outside of CERN. So this picture shows in the first half of the year 2017 some stats. We have been having more than 400 issues on GitHub, more than 700 pull requests done by about 62 committers. So it's pretty busy. There is 4 to 6 pull requests on an average day. I was actually underlining the nature of the framework of Invenio. So there are two possible points of view of the system. From the point of view of a framework, it's actually an ecosystem of independent collaborative packages. We have released more than 100 packages that collaborate with each other through REST APIs. They have well-separated roles with the Unix philosophy, do one thing only, but do it well, which enables people to compose custom solutions. For example, out of the jungle of the components, one can pick only the components one is interested in green, which gives the custom solutions. Advantage of this is actually that every different functionality, such as holdings or circulation, can evolve in its own pace outside of the rest of the ecosystem, and it can be also maintained by the other teams. So we can get to a very fast release cycle. Of course, the price to pay is the complexity. And in order to reduce the complexity, another point of view is what we are putting together a bundle of interesting packages for several use cases, which we call flavors. So it's similar to ePrint flavors or box solutions. In the past year, we have published the Invenio app ILS, which is the integrated library system solution. So in order to install it, everything is on PyPy. If you know Python, you would just do pip install Invenio app ILS, and it will download all the important packages which are listed on the left from the dependency system of Python. So we know that, for example, it will use Mark21 as the underlying storage model. You need probably search, record, persistent identity store, OAI server, and several other packages. So this is actually coming with a pre-packaged bundles for the use. So where we are, in the past year, Invenio 3 was put in production. At CERN, there are several installations, such as CERN Analysis Preservation, which are running on Invenio 3 right now, or Zenodo, which is the same technology we are using for physics, but offering to all kinds of research discipline as part of the open air European projects, has been migrated to Invenio 3 as well, and there are several more installations. So the status of the packages we are publishing, we are dividing them roughly into categories such as base technology, it's connected to database, the core features that everybody needs, probably a metadata store or persistent identifier store. Another one is the add-on features, which is typical circulation. You probably don't need if you are a data repository. And at the end, we are publishing also a lot of standalone utilities. For example, PID, utility managing library, or Flask ecosystem modules for menu and other things. Last year, we have opened a new GitHub organizations for contributions, which is basically packages not developed by the core Invenio team, but by anybody else out in the world who are not necessarily following the same code quality practices as we do. So this has seen a lot of usage as well. On the right-hand side, you have an example of the packages and the typical build status, which is almost always passing everywhere. Typical code coverage, which is close to 100% everywhere, because with the rewrite of Invenio, we pay a lot of attention to good test coverage of the code. And on the right-hand side, it's very small, you cannot see, but packages are released as alpha or beta on PyPy. And this is actually pointing to our roadmap. What we are doing right now and what will be our plans in the next few months is actually to finalize the package release from alpha through beta up to production. So it means basically stabilizing our APIs, providing a richer documentation, and providing data migration support for the packages. So now that Invenio 3 is in production since several months at CERN for several use cases, we have actually seen what works less well, and we are amending the APIs and providing rich documentation for outside of usage. So the packages we are publishing are coming with bundles. There is a stable base bundle, which is base technology, which is already published and well documented out there. Record bundle is what you would like to store all the records in the JSON schema-based metadata store. This is all well done. Right now, these weeks, we are working on finishing up the access control bundle. Access control is implemented, but we are basically documenting it for people to make more easy use of it. And later, over the summer, we'll start the files bundle, which is actually storage of files into buckets and associated file system and the deposit. So this is what is coming, and we are expecting maybe somewhere in the autumn, Invenio 3 might be even more easily used, thanks to this documentation. And afterwards, we are attaching the flavors. So as I was mentioning, the ILS flavor is already out there, but it's limited in functionality. So when we make the releases of packages stable and well documented, it will permit us to bundle them together in flavors for ease of use. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so now we're going to talk DSpace. I'm Tim Donahue, the DSpace tech lead at DuraSpace. And I'm going to assume that most of you have kind of heard of DSpace a little bit here, but I do gloss over a little bit of what we're about. But if you haven't heard yet, we have a new logo that we have stickers for. They're out at the registration desk. You can also find them at the Atmeyer desk and Science desk, two of our major service providers. The new logo is the one over on your right, of course. So we're transitioning to that as part of the DSpace 7 efforts, which you'll hear more about today after lunch as well. But DSpace is now 15 years old. We strive to be the out-of-the-box sort of turnkey institutional repository platform of choice. So that's kind of our goal along the way, and we've been doing that for 15 years at this point in time. And by out of the box, these are the sort of things we're looking for. We're trying to hit the main features that most people want out of something that's a repository-like system. So we're really striving towards things like SEO, accepting anything, allowing you to structure it how you want, add metadata, customizing, configuration, all of that sort of stuff, and hitting a lot of the major new best practices and standards as they appear along the way. A couple little, some statistics here about DSpace. So we're still the largest open source or proprietary repository system worldwide. Over 2,000 known sites, 120 countries, translated in over 20 languages. We're now up to 16 registered service providers distributed pretty diversely worldwide. And that grows on a regular basis. We strive towards annual software releases. Recently, we've had some much more major significant changes in modernizing the software. So that's been a little bit less annual, but maybe every other year or a year and a half. And as I mentioned, 15 years old, so we've been around for a while, but we're constantly striving to stay up to date, constantly striving to adapt and modernize the platform. One statistic I do want to point out here is that we're getting more and more activity within the code base. The last 4 years has been the most people actually helping contribute to DSpace since the history of the project, since it started 15 years ago. And with 6.0 late last year, we finally broke over 60 into the 70 range of number of contributors for a given release. So these are unique people giving code back to our platform and helping improve it over time. So it's kind of exciting to see that going up. I like to think, I mean, we're all doing a great job. We're adapting to modern standards and working hard to make sure our platforms are up to date. As a 15-year-old system, obviously things get a little bit, cruddy underneath at times. So we're constantly trying to adapt and modernize and improve the platform and make sure that we're as up to date as possible and refactor our code and all of that. So this is sort of the history of where we've been the last 4 years. 6.0 is our current latest release out there, and that involved a major Java API underneath refactor, as well as a major refactor of our configuration model to allow configuration to be a lot easier. We have a 6.1 release that will be out immediately after Open Repositories, which involves a lot of bug fixes, some performance improvements with that major API refactor. But that should be out actually in very early July. We have folks working on it back in the States and in Europe and all over the place right now as we speak, finishing up that release. And 7.0 is really what we're excited about next. So it's now we've got our underlying API there. We're modernizing our REST API towards better best practices and standards, more modern ones, and we're moving towards Angular. So there's going to be a lot more about that effort immediately after lunch. Actually, I have my slides in a different order than I thought. So there'll be much more about that a little bit after lunch to talk through what exactly has gone into that process, where we are, how we got to the decision on the Angular platform, and where we're going next. But another thing I wanted to mention here, so we've been adapting the software, of course. I also see us as a really good example, and I think we all kind of exemplar this as well. We're all good exemplars for this, of open source collaboration. I mentioned we have 16 service providers. The DSpace 7 efforts in building the new REST API and the new Angular REST API would not be going as smoothly and as quickly if we didn't have our service providers directly involved with that. So two of our major service providers in Atmire and Forscience are collaborating to help us really modernize the platform in this DSpace 7 user interface working group. I'm not going to go into much more detail about that now because that will be the talk after lunch, but if you're interested in that, that is where we'll be detailing that much more detail in the future of DSpace and core update session. You'll hear about the DSpace 7 efforts, where they're going, how we got to where we are now. You'll hear a little bit more about contributing to DSpace and also some about the DSpace CRIS efforts out of Forscience and how that is paralleling the efforts of DSpace and going to come back into the main code base. So that's all really, really exciting. We're excited to see the platform move forward. We're excited with the Angular user interface coming along, and we want to see more people get involved with that. And if you're interested, join us after lunch or talk to me. I'll be around all week. But our big challenge on the DSpace side, so we have a lot of people giving back. We have great service providers. Our challenging is really in the funding model for maintaining the coordination effort that we want to be able to maintain to get all this, this great effort coming from the community organized in a way that we're not duplicating effort and that we're able to actually move the platform along even quicker through better coordination. So I would encourage you to consider becoming a member. Talk to me if you're interested in what that means. We're also, the DSpace steering group is really looking towards providing better membership benefits in the coming years. So if you have ideas about what you might like to see about around membership, talk to me about that. Talk to Deborah Henkin-Kurtz, the CEO of DuraSpace as well. She's around. It also does fund the coordination. So my role in DSpace is entirely funded by membership. So if you like to see what DuraSpace is doing for DSpace and helping coordinate the efforts of the service providers, of all these contributors, please consider giving back. And this is our obligatory slide of all of our current members right now. I'll point out a couple from the immediate region here. We got Griffith University, of course, one of the sponsors of the conference, also University of Adelaide, University of Technology Sweden, or not Sweden, Sydney? Wrong area of the world. University of Technology Sydney, I apologize. And the University of Auckland out of New Zealand, of course. So we'd like to see a lot more institutions up here on this list, and we'd really like to talk to you about what that would mean to you in terms of becoming a member of DSpace and of DuraSpace in general. And if you want to get more involved, we have established a Slack channel within the last year. So you can go to our wiki and join up with a Slack invite right away. If you want to be involved in the day-to-day activities, that's really where the day-to-day happens. If you're just interested in getting updates, we got our mailing lists, of course. And there's other support options via Stack Overflow and all those other things out on the wiki as well. And I think that is it for me. Yeah, I'll hand it off. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Will Fyson from ePrint Services, and we manage and run ePrint, appropriately enough, another open source repository that you're probably all sort of vaguely familiar with. So just to provide a brief introduction, I'll talk a little bit about the architecture, just a sort of ePrint, just a smidgen about architecture, and then a bit about our open source community and how we sort of approach ePrint's development, and then go through some of our future plans and recent developments that we've been working on. So here we have a slide just on the architecture of ePrints briefly. You'll notice there's a sort of big blue core going right through the middle. That is our repository of persistent managed objects. This is a very sort of abstract idea that can actually be applied in a variety of different contexts, and I'll explore that a little bit more a little bit later. But this core is underpinned by various computer science standards, technologies, protocols that one would expect in such a system. And on top of that, we have the open access infrastructure that's designed to support a range of different stakeholders, from the researchers to librarians to the general public. So to provide all the sort of repository features that you're all probably familiar with at this stage. We also have an element of sort of research management for administrators, so they can get reports on data that's in the repository, on like download stats, all that sort of stuff. So useful things. One thing that we have on ePrints is the ePrints Bazaar. And so this is like an app store, essentially, for the repository. And this allows us to really sort of harness our open source community, where people can provide contributions to the repository, and they sort of sit away from the main core of the repository, and you can just install them with sort of a one-click install. It allows you to sort of customize repositories quite quickly and easily to different effects that suit your institution. So for example, one thing that I've been working on recently with the Bazaar is working on an ORCID plugin. So ORCID is this new, reasonably new thing that's emerged in this community lately, and lots of repositories are needing to start recording ORCIDs. So the Bazaar app for this is something that allows us to just quickly add that sort of functionality into the repositories that request it. So that's one thing. Alternatively, the Bazaar also allows us to support, for example, like new funder policies. So in the UK, there is the REF process. This is an assessment of research institutions and their research outputs and decides how much funding they should all get in the future. And so by developing a plugin here, essentially it's a plugin that UK institutions can install on their repositories, and it will help check that their research outputs are compliant for the whole REF process. So that's the kind of thing that the Bazaar is very useful for. It allows us to be quite flexible and responsive to the changing landscape. Going back to the community for a moment, ePrint is over 15 years old, nearly 20 years old actually, I guess. So we've been around for a while, and we've sort of evolved as the open access community has evolved. There are now 635 ePrint repositories at last count on Raw. And this is largely supported by ePrint services. So we're based in the University of Southampton, and our role is quite multifaceted. We support our customers by providing hosting and training and bespoke development, but we also try to curate the general sort of core open source core of ePrints, and just provide general bug fixes and general sort of maintenance and development as time goes by. So we've got quite a lot of roles, and sort of balancing those off is an interesting challenge. We've got our strongest community presence is in the UK. We also have quite a large German language group. And we also have quite a number of repositories here in Australia, which is nice. So it's good to be here and meet some of our customers sort of face to face. So to move on to some of the ePrints developments that we have in mind, we envisage the future of ePrints as being this sort of case where, and this I think is in line with the core next generation repository goals of repositories have this opportunity to form a globally networked infrastructure with research right at the center. And we're currently on ePrints version 3.3, and we're progressing to 3.4. And the idea there is sort of a scaling back of what we've got, because, as I was saying, we have evolved as the open access community has evolved over time. And so ePrints has become this quite big bit of software that's really good for publications. But we're sort of aiming to scale that back a bit, and then so that we can build up on that sort of core that I mentioned earlier, the blue core of persistent managed objects, into different purposes. So with that in mind, we've also, we've got this, the idea of ePrints flavors. So we've got a number of different flavors in the pipeline at the moment, or some of which have actually been produced, I guess. And we're always looking for new ideas for flavors. So we have, at the basics, we have this 0 flavor that is very basic, doesn't really do very much, but you can build whatever you like on top of it. We've got the publications flavor, which is very much your traditional ePrint experience. We've got a data flavor, which is for research data. This often sort of sits alongside a publications repository. The idea that an institution can, their institutional papers can point to the data repository to sort of show the data for the paper. Other types of repositories we're developing are educational ones for sharing educational resources. So these are quite useful for lecturers, for example, who want to share all their lecture materials online, either with their students or with their peers. And similarly, this is sort of something that could be used for the creation of MOOCs, the massively online open courses. I think that's what it stands for. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's also a social media repository that we're working on, otherwise known as the Tweepository. Although I don't really like that name, it makes it sound a bit, well, twee. This is for harvesting Twitter data, and so I've been working with some of my friends and colleagues in the Web Science Doctoral Training Centre at Southampton who know all about harvesting Twitter data and what for them would make a really good tool for that sort of stuff. So I've been working on that for harvesting their tweets. And also we've been working with our friends from the University of Glasgow on a impact repository, impact flavor. This is for sort of capturing all those social, economical outputs from academic research that don't normally get captured in just by recording academic publications. So I'll go through a few recent developments we've been working on. One of them is the ORCID support plugin that I mentioned earlier. So this is a bizarre app that adds all sorts of ORCID functionality. This has been, there's a lot of input from the UK user group here, where they were very clear on what they wanted about ORCID. Not only do they want to sort of store them for their users and their authors, but also they want lots of reports on the kind of content that is being stored, so that administrators want to be able to know who in the repository, for example, does and doesn't have an ORCID registered by their name. And we've got future plans there to synchronize that content in the repository with what's on ORCID user profiles. And we're sort of collecting together all the efforts that have gone on in various repositories, basically into one plugin so that everyone can just install it nicely and easily. So that's something we've been working on. We've also been working on our IR stats package. This is this provides statistics about the repository, download stats and whatnot. This is available on version 3.4. It's just providing a much more intuitive interface because, as it's been mentioned before, ePrints is a very old sort of system now. It's been around for a long time, and it needs to move with the times as far as user interfaces are concerned. So we've been working on that, and it's also a much better at filtering out robots and crawlers and things, the kind of things that muddy up your download stats. A quick glance at a few other development highlights that we've got. We've been working on something just called lists. Sounds very boring and basic, and it is to a certain extent, but it allows you to collect sort of arbitrary collections of records together. So if you've got like a particular collection you want to highlight on your front page of your repository, you could bring them all under that one group. Similarly, if you just wanted to, that is also useful for things like lecture courses, as I mentioned earlier. We're adding visualizations to the repository, so you've got more sort of colorful visual looks at the data. We've been working on a reporting framework. This is another thing that the UK user group has been sort of talking about quite a bit. They really want lots of ways of interrogating their data records, so we've been working on that. That's a bizarre plugin. And this introduction of faceted search, which is all about filtering down the search results. So just very briefly at the end, we've got a number of challenges, which is namely managing an ever-changing sort of business model in this environment, because we're open source, but we have to support our customers, and we have to sort of provide development, general maintenance developments for things like Google Scholar and bug fixes, sort of improving that sort of stuff. So we're sort of straddling this line of providing new things for our customers and stuff for the open source community, but we're exploring this new context for ePrints is quite an exciting way of moving that forwards and finding new ways of adapting our business model to carry on. So it's all a very exciting future. Thank you very much for listening.
So hi, everybody. My name is David Wilcox. I'm the product manager for Fedora. I work with Tim at DuraSpace, which is the institutional home of not just Fedora, but also DSpace and Vivo as well. Tim had mentioned that DSpace has been around for a while, about 15 years, and actually Fedora's been around now for 20 years. So this is actually the 20th anniversary of Fedora, which is great, and you know, that's part of that is because Fedora has started out not just as a piece of software, but really as a concept. This idea of a flexible and extensible, durable object repository architecture. This was first proposed in a paper before it was developed into software. And so these kind of different aspects of Fedora, I think, are important to understanding what it is. As Fedora is not just software; it is an idea, and this idea has carried through all of the versions of Fedora as it sort of changed over these 20 years of its life cycle. But Fedora is also a community, like many of our platforms here, Fedora is not just an open source solution, it's really a community source solution where all of the development effort and involvement in the project really comes from the community of stakeholders and users that support the software. So it's an important part of what Fedora is. In terms of just some of the details, I think you can describe Fedora fairly simply as it's software that stores, preserves and provides access to digital objects. And part of the way it does that is providing a lot of flexibility. So that the F in Fedora, I think, is a really important part. And that flexibility really allows you to support not just very simple use cases, which it does well, but also very complex use cases, recognizing that really over time, even if you start out with very simple use cases, the complexity tends to grow as you do more work with your repository and start dealing with more difficult and kind of heterogeneous assets. And so Fedora is really designed to kind of grow and change over time to be able to support these different use cases. Primarily it does that by being really based on linked data. So in addition to being kind of an object repository, Fedora is really fundamentally linked data infrastructure. It is a linked data server, and the way you model objects in Fedora is using RDF. And so I think that's a really fundamental part of what Fedora provides, is this sort of native linked data support that really lets it behave not just as sort of a siloed piece of library software, but a native web application that's meant to interact like other applications on the web using web standards. And so, Fedora, of course, scales. It supports millions of objects. It doesn't have restrictions in particular on things like file sizes. But it's also designed really to interoperate. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation, but fundamentally it is a middleware application. It's infrastructure. And so we have here representatives from Samvera and Islandora to talk about kind of the frameworks around Fedora. But really Fedora is meant to plug into a variety of systems and services, and that's kind of core to what it offers as a platform. And so in terms of kind of the value proposition, why you would use Fedora, I think this is something we went to our community with and asking the Fedora stakeholders themselves why they use Fedora. Because people use it in a variety of scenarios and for different reasons. But some commonalities sort of bubbled to the surface. And certainly flexibility, which I've already mentioned, is a major driver for why people adopt Fedora as opposed to some other systems. But also the sensibilities around durability. So something like digital preservation is complex. There is no one application that's kind of solves digital preservation for an institution. But Fedora is really meant to fit into a larger digital preservation solution, provide some aspects of durability itself, but also provide ways to interoperate with other applications you might be using that fully support the kind of digital preservation workflows that you may have at your institutions. In addition, I think it's important to note that Fedora has been successful. As I said, it's been around for 20 years. There's over 400 installations that are public that we know about, probably more than that. And it's been around, it's been tested and it's been proven. I think that's an important part of why people adopt Fedora. As well, something that we've been really focused on is standards. So especially in the latest iteration of Fedora, Fedora 4, we've been really focused on web standards out of the W3C and other bodies that are trying to get us away from custom code and custom ways of doing things and really just trying to behave, as I said earlier, more like a native web application and working in the way that you would expect web applications to work. So that's an important part of what Fedora does. And just going back to this community aspect, the real value of adopting Fedora, like many of the other applications that we're talking about here, is that you're joining a community. It's very difficult for institutions to kind of go it alone and maintain software over time. People come and go, expertise comes and goes, certainly funding comes and goes, mostly goes. And so the idea of having a community to back your project that you can turn to, that we can kind of all support one another, is a big part of why people use applications like Fedora. I mentioned this earlier, but just to note, we're going to hear from Tom and Melissa about Samvera and Islandora. These applications, what they have in common, these two frameworks, is Fedora. So they are both based on Fedora at the core. It's the kind of key component of both of those systems. And that often is the way that we sort of recommend people go first. So if you're not using Fedora currently, often people don't use Fedora on its own. They use it as part of a system. You can build a custom framework around Fedora, leveraging the REST API and other aspects, but really a lot of that heavy lifting has already been done for you. Many of your use cases will be covered by either Samvera or Islandora or both, and so really I would encourage you to take a look at those frameworks if you're kind of curious about Fedora and what it provides, because Fedora is really just a piece of that overall framework. We thought about sort of some of the conference themes around supporting open scholarship and open science, and I really have this slide just to point out that in addition to sort of the software itself, members of the Fedora community are involved in some of these broader efforts that go beyond just the repository. And so I noted a couple of them here. Myself and other members of the Fedora community have been participating in the Research Data Alliance for a number of years. I co-founded a couple of groups around research data repositories, but also repository interoperability and trying to kind of standardize on ways of moving data in between different platforms that we all use. And some of the work in the Fedora community has been really critical to that. Within the Fedora community, we've worked on standardizing on import-export formats and tools for getting data in and out, and that has fed into some of these efforts in the Research Data Alliance around possible ways to standardize on moving data between the different platforms and services that we use. Additionally, here at the conference, the CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, has a next generation repository working group that I'm on, along with a number of other people that are here. There's a presentation later today if you want to know more about that effort, but this is just trying to define ways that these kind of next generation repositories can be more web-centric, more interoperable, and Fedora is a big part of that. Fedora is kind of in line with this vision of the next generation of repositories. So all of this is sort of working towards this idea of more openness and interoperability between platforms. Similarly with the open science framework. So later in the conference as well, I'll be on a panel talking about integrating Fedora with the open science framework. This is a collaboration between the Center for Open Science, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Notre Dame. And a few of us are here at the conference to talk about the work that has been going on to make this an integration. And so I don't have a lot of time right now to talk about what OSF is, but certainly I'd encourage you to take a look at this as kind of an open platform for research and scholarship that Fedora is now a part of, offering preservation and archiving and linked data sensibilities that were not necessarily available in that platform up until now. So that's the software. In terms of the community, Tim mentioned this, similarly to DSpace, Fedora, again, is a DuraSpace project. It is funded entirely by the community members, so there isn't really any kind of grant funding right now that's funding the staff positions on the project. Myself and Andrew Woods, who's here today, is the technical lead, and I'm the product manager. Our positions, our ability to travel and put on workshops and training and user group meetings, and all of these things are all funded by the community. And all of the development comes from the community as well. The community itself is quite large. Last year we had 74 member institutions. Many of you are here, and I certainly want to say thank you to all of you that are from institutions that support the project. This is a critical part of how we are able to be sustainable and secure over the long term. Several are institutions from the region. You can see their logos around here, so there is support really all over the world, and that's an important part of how we do things. The idea is that institutions join at whatever kind of funding level is appropriate and sustainable over the long term, and we're just trying to get as many institutions that use Fedora as possible to contribute funding at whatever level is sustainable. Just a snapshot of the community. As I mentioned, over 400 sites. Mailing list continues to grow. Our main mailing list is the community list, which has over 1,000 members. There's also a smaller technical list and other kind of community lists within the Samvera and Islandora community. I mentioned the number of institutions, and each year, I'm defining active developers here as basically developers that have contributed code to a release within the last year. So within that kind of metric, there were 25, and there's a smaller number amongst those that are kind of committers on the project, but these are just developers that are contributing. As well, we run over 14 workshops a year. We ran one here at Open Repositories that are opportunities to get some training and support for Fedora, and we run camps as well. So we have a combined Fedora and Samvera camp in the UK at Oxford in September, and then we have a Fedora camp, a 3-day kind of event in Austin, Texas in October. So if you're interested in attending any of those, you can come and see me or look it up online. online. Those are great opportunities. So I just have a few links here, and we'll move on to the next one. I also wanted to mention any of you that would like a t-shirt, we have these wonderful Fedora t-shirts that we printed up. It's a great design, they're free. I do not want to take any of these back to Canada with me, so please come and take a t-shirt. I'm going to have all of them at our Fedora interest group session after lunch. I'll just lay them out on a table, so come grab a shirt or a sticker or whatever you like. So that is it for me, and I'll turn it over to Tom.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Kramer from Stanford University. I'm representing the project formerly known as Hydra, and now known on a rolling basis as Samvera, or Samvera, depending on your regionalisms. So perhaps the most notable thing to report is after a not completely voluntary catalytic action by a letter from a trademark holder, internationally, we have decided to rebrand ourselves, both in the name and the logo. So I'm glad that we are keeping pace with DSpace, but maybe we tried to one-up you by also changing the name. I don't recommend trying it yourself. That said, I haven't figured out how to draw this as a tree yet, and so I'm going to present, for those of you who are not familiar with kind of the architecture or kind of the aspirations behind Samvera, it relates to really what a repository is all about, which is that there are great systems and methods for maintaining individual types of digital content, and many of us have multiple types of these kinds of systems in our individual environments. Unfortunately, those end up being rather onerous to maintain in multiple forms. And so the beauty of a repository is that you can take things like ETDs, books, articles, images, data sets, and actually store and manage them in one big digital asset management or digital repository to govern access, provide management, take preservation actions. But at the same time, you want to have highly customized interfaces and workflows for different content types and different consumers. And that is the nature of the Samvera architecture. Hopefully next year we will not be using this slide, but I think the philosophy still holds true. And from the very beginning, Hydra and Samvera now have been really focused on trying to provide an application framework that gives individual institutions enough flexibility to provide, assemble their own applications to meet the needs of their local users. And you can see a technical stack. I'm still amazed by the Invenio stack, and we need to do something that is way more complicated than this because it's very impressive. But in a simplified notion, the major components are Fedora and Solr. There's a bunch of Ruby on Rails tooling and individual Ruby gems, which also encapsulates Blacklight, which is another open source project, a faceted browser in its own right, and these are wrapped into applications that sit at the topmost level. One of the most prominent of which has been Sophia and is now known as Hyrax. These have been combined to produce many different types of applications. So some of the different ones that we have to showcase, we have data repositories, we have statewide aggregators, we have digital repositories that include digital library collections, institutional repository content and publications. We have electronic and research archives. We have customized environments around things like GIS or media. Princeton University has a fantastic digitization workflow Samvera application called Plum. And we have just the traditional institutional repository. And at this point, we've seen Hydra/Samvera has been used successfully by institutions running the full gamut, from large institutions, colleges, national digital repositories, national ministries, national laboratories, to individual research laboratories, down to things like performing arts festivals and a Shakespeare festival. And it's been assembled and remixed to do everything from self-deposit systems all the way through back office systems, digital library collections, and more. So it's been quite successful, I think, as an application framework. For a long time, we've also held on to this notion that really things like institutional repository deposit or theses and dissertations are not radically different from institution to institution. And our aspiration has always been to build solution bundles. And over the last 2 years in particular, there's been radical progress made on that. The two most prominent are Haiku, which is the product from the Hydra in a Box project, and also Avalon Media System, which is a time-based media digital repository, digital library system. Both of those share an incredible amount of componentry with another system called Hyrax, which is the rebranded Sophia. I think I'm going to talk about internationalization a little bit. We need a translation file just for Hydra names. I think trying to figure out how to distinguish or how the various projects distinguish each other, there's a lot of similarities between all of the people up here. Samvera is perhaps the most gregarious of the projects. It's a group of people that likes to assemble in large numbers at various places around the world and spends a lot of time working with each other, both face-to-face and online. This is a picture of the Samvera Connect, or Hydra Connect, from Boston Public Library last fall, where we had 260 people from 90 institutions gathering to just coordinate. On a worldwide basis, there's the requisite number of pins. I think it's useful to note that Samvera actually has no center, really. It was designed from the beginning as a distributed project, and the core organizing principle are known as partners in the project. So these are institutions that have voluntarily signed an MOU and committed their own resources, and most things are done through sweat equity or individual institutional commitment out of the rational realization that if you didn't do it together, you'd have to be doing it on your own. And in terms of GitHub activity, right now there are 64 licensed contributing institutions. We make each institution that's contributing code sign a contributing licensing agreement from Apache 2 or Apache 2 style. There are 280 individually licensed individuals. There's about, according to OpenHub, there's 18 person years of effort, and it's ranked as a very large, mature code base with stable year-over-year commits. So it's, I think, doing well. The nice thing about this visualization is, though we're not seeing necessarily commits back, we are seeing increasing traction in some unexpected quarters of the world with these little green zones in various places, not the usual suspects. For communication, just to give you a sense of the size and scope, there are about 130 Samvera partners. These are people from partner institutions, 750 more or less people on the technical list, 600 plus on the community list. But what we've really seen, and I'd be interested to hear, is that Slack has just taken over as the predominant form of communication, and there are now approaching 500 people on active members of the Slack team. I mentioned that we're gregarious. It's also very self-organizing. I don't think it's out of a love of process, but people actually looking for birds of a feather. And this is a list of the currently active, mostly active, we kind of cull the list every year, but currently active interest and working groups in the community. And what's interesting is Hydra originated as a developer-driven project and was very successful, I think, for a long time as developers were collaborating with each other. What we saw in our individual institutions is repository managers, user experience designers, system administrators, DevOps specialists were looking for those same types of connections. And what we found is that they've snapped onto and joined the community in full force. And you can see from just some of the ones that are bolded, there are active groups about how do you run agile development projects, active groups for repository service managers, active groups for people working on documentation or defining analytics to specific parts of the technical componentry, as well as subject-specific areas like GIS. How do you model and deliver GIS assets? Over the last year or two, is talking again about the themes for the conference, there have been some specific technical innovations, and Mike Giarlo, who is at Stanford and is doing a lot of work specifically around Hyrax and Haiku, kind of summed it up in a few words is basically a lot more features, a lot of convergence of different code, an emphasis on configuration over coding, and a lot more polish overall on the stack. And so some of the areas, and we've seen some similarities, better deployment options. There's now a custom workflow engine is one of the things that we've greatly admired from platforms like DSpace has now been written in. Increasing emphasis on APIs like IIIF, resource sync, and linked data overall. A real consolidation of code between two of the major libraries, which were Sophia and curation concerns, into a single application, which eases both adoption as well as code contribution, and a lot more plugins so people can mix and match and provide some of the modularity. At Hydra Connect last year, we had a great keynote speech from Alberto Martinez from the Colegio de Mexico. And he says, we're very interested in Hydra, but we find that the lack of translations isn't really there for us. There was a clarion call, and code actually started happening while Alberto was still talking. This week, we announced the full support for internationalization with 8 translation files in Hydra in a Box /Haiku. In terms of community innovations, exciting things to see. The community is still evolving. There are now 8 different registered commercial service providers that are doing consulting, contracting, or hosting. And by registered, I mean we put them on a list on the wiki. We still have some aspirations to go about maybe formalizing the way some of our fellow projects have done. We've now produced an annual report that looks somewhat professional, and there's a concerted effort to take the technical road mapping and development from sort of a mosh pit, robust, open source, let the good ideas emerge, to a more deliberative and planful approach to technical road mapping involving more members of the community. And in conclusion, I think one of the big things that has been widely anticipated is the output of the Hydra in a Box project. We now have code that is up in beta. And in a nutshell, this is meant to be the best of Samvera technology, but in a turnkey package. It's cloud ready with multi-tenancy support. No development is required for adopters. It's configuration rather than coding. A full set of modern APIs. There's a lot of anticipation for this. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., there are going to be 2 sessions that are dealing with Haiku. I encourage you to come to them if you are interested. And if you would like to just give it a whirl yourself, you can actually create a repository on the fly through a forms wizard at demo.hydrainabox.org. So take it for a spin, and you can talk to many of us who are here this week if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.
All right, I think I'm last one up. So Islandora, like everyone here, is an open source repository solution. It was founded at the University of Prince Edward Island in 2006, so I guess we're 11 years old. In terms of describing how Islandora works, we prefer to step away from the wall of text and use some more simple visual metaphors that we've kind of congealed over the years. So there are 2 major versions of Islandora that are currently in development and being supported by our community. The first is a cheeseburger, and the second is a lobster chimera. Let me explain. So the cheeseburger model is Islandora 7X, and this is what's being used by the vast majority of our community right now. This is Islandora as it's popularly adopted. And what we're using is Drupal 7 for our front end. Provides both a website where your end users can access your repository, and it's also a graphical interface where administrators can actually work with the content and build the site. We're using Fedora 3, the older version of Fedora, as our repository layer. We have Apache Solr for search and discovery, which gives us nice real-time indexing and faceted searching. And we have solution packs and tools and utilities, which are kind of the toppings on the cheeseburger that you can pick and choose and take out and take in to customize your repository to what your institution needs without having to do any additional development. There's about 4 dozen in our official release, different modules you can pick and choose, and probably 3 times that amount out in our community built by institutions that are using Islandora and have made their own solutions and shared them back on GitHub. Islandora Claw, the chimerical lobster. We had to move away from the cheeseburger metaphor because as we move to Fedora 4 as our backend, and Fedora 4 is a major departure from Fedora 3, we're also taking the opportunity to re-architect how Islandora works, so that we take better advantage of what Fedora does best, and we're taking better advantage of what Drupal does as well. So we're moving to the latest supported version of Drupal, which is Drupal 8. And we're integrating much more closely with all of the different components so that your front end feels much more Drupal-y and you can just use Drupal contributed modules, and we cut down on those 45 Islandora modules that we're supporting right now by just letting you use the Drupal versions. And this takes us away from that discretely layered cheeseburger model to something that's much more tightly integrated, where all of those pieces are really working together. This is a quick and cartoony diagram of what the stack looks like. I think, is this a laser pointer? No. I'll just talk about it then. So this is the Islandora claw diagram. If you want to get into much more technical detail, we do have a session tomorrow at 3:30 in the Fedora interest group track, so please do attend that. But if you like the cartoon version, as you can see, our front end is Drupal. Right now, we have solutions for hosting images and collections because we're in very early stages. We're using Fedora for our repository. And we have multiple services that are connecting those two, but most of the work is being done by our little Apache Camel service that we call Alpaca and made a fuzzy avatar for. And a lot of the core functionality of Islandora has moved into microservices, which are these slim little bits of code that just do one or two things and allows us to be a lot more scalable and have things happen asynchronously. So we have microservices that do things like handle your OCR or map your Fedora resources to Drupal entities and just do that in a little one-off bit in a tiny piece of code. We also have a Vagrant build so that everybody developing this project can be working on exactly the same environment. So you just fire up your own copy of it and everybody's in the same place. And we keep our documentation alongside development. This was kind of a philosophy that we approached when we started Club. We wanted to write the documentation while developing the project, so it didn't end up being something added on as an afterthought after the fact. Current development for Islandora Claw is working towards the goal of an MVP. This is the minimum viable product, or we consulted with our community to find out what is the bare functionality that Islandora Claw has to have for you to start working with it. So this isn't supposed to be production ready, but it is supposed to be testable and workable, and this is where we can then go back to our community and build a new list and take this forward from beta to something that the community can start migrating to. So we like arbitrary deadlines, so we had an alpha release at our Islandora conference back in May, and we're going to have the beta release of the MVP tomorrow during that session I mentioned at 3:30. So if you want to see what the Islandora Claw MVP beta looks like, I encourage you to join us. How we're getting this work done is through community development. The Islandora Foundation itself is very small. There's only 2 employees. So the vast majority of Islandora is developed and maintained by the people that are using it. We use GitHub as a common platform so that all of our development happens in the open, and we have some control over our workflows. And we use multiple multiple GitHub organizations for each of our projects. Whoops. There we go. So we have a repo for our core release. We have a repo for Islandora Claw development. We have a repo for experimental modules that are maybe not quite ready for prime time or we want to work on. We have places to put our deprecated things, and we use that as kind of our home base for development work. We also use a Jira ticketing system hosted by JiraSpace, and this allows anybody out there using Islandora to report a bug, ask for a feature, ask for an improvement, and our developer community reviews those tickets every 2 weeks so we can come together and determine what we're going to do with those requests. In terms of releases, Islandora Claw is steaming towards its first release tomorrow, but Islandora 7X is still being released twice yearly in April and October, and this is done entirely by volunteers. So we tend to have around 40 to 45 people from our community, and dozens of institutions come together and they test, they document, they audit our licenses and our README files, they maintain our code between releases. And these are just some of the logos from our various release teams over since we started this. The Islandora community that's doing all this work, there's a few different ways to look at it. This is our community by the numbers. So we know of more than 150 public sites. There's probably double again that number out there in development or just quietly installing Islandora and not really engaging very much with our community. We have almost 1,400 people on our listserv. We have 144 people on our GitHub orgs. We've got 29 official committers. These are contributors to the project that have made significant contributions and engaged at such a level that we've recognized them with additional responsibilities and rights towards the project. 26 of our modules were built by Islandora users and then contributed back to the foundation for everyone else to use. 29 members in the Islandora Foundation. We have 11 self-organized interest groups, a lot like Semvera does. We've had 7 of these volunteer-led software releases since 2013. We have had 16 Islandora camps. We've had 2 full Islandora conferences. And we're supporting 2 major versions at the same time. And all of this is happening with 2 full-time employees. Myself, I'm the project and community manager, and my colleague, Danny Lamb, who was hired just after the last Open Repositories when we doubled the size of the Islandora Foundation. He's our new technical lead. Another look at our community is where Islandora is being used. So this is an installation map showing those 150 or so public installations that we know about. A lot of use in North America, Canada and the US, and Europe. As you can see, we do have 1 dot here in Australia. We'd love to see more. And behind this community, kind of stewarding the project in the background, is the Islandora Foundation. We're an independent nonprofit. We were founded in July 2013 at the Open Repositories Conference in Charlottetown. And our mandate is to steward both the project and the community that's maintaining that project. We're member funded. These are the 29 institutions that are currently keeping us afloat. We're just barely properly funded, so we're operating without a net, so new members are always very, very welcome. And in terms of the structure, we operate under a board of directors drawn from our partner institutions. We have a roadmap committee that kind of acts as an operational body and meets fairly often and works more closely with the project. We have official committers, and these are kind of people who've been elected to be stewards of the code base itself and have control over what changes happen to the Islandora code base. And we have 2 full-time staff members. And if you want to know more, this is our contact information. That's us.
So we now have an opportunity for folks to ask questions of the panel. So I unfortunately don't have a microphone runner, so if you could ask your question loudly and then I will repeat it back for the camera. So, nobody to run it though. Yeah. Any questions? Thanks.
I'll get started by asking a question, and then I'll pass the microphone around.
Thank you.
My question for the panel is, what are the biggest challenges facing each of your repositories this year?
I think other than picking a new name with like 500 people with opinions, which was probably the biggest challenge we had, and I think why parents don't crowdsource the names of their children. I think the biggest challenge for us has been trying to systematize or move to the more community-based road mapping, to go from kind of the ad hoc development that's worked very well for the project while it was in an early stage to a more deliberate process that's involving more people who might want to contribute but not have the cycles and bandwidth to be heavy-duty contributors to track the issues. So they're good models for doing this, and it's kind of a learning and growth process for us, and it looks promising at this point, but there's still work to do.
Probably for us, it's resources, especially where we're trying to develop a whole new platform while still maintaining the current one. I mean, our institutions tend to be smaller. They've chosen Islandora because they don't have a lot of developer resources, which means they don't have a lot of developer resources to give back to the project necessarily. So for us, it means a lot of trying to find other ways for our user community to engage and contribute other than development that still help keep the project going. But 2 major versions is a big chore with not enough developers, because there's never enough developers.
Yeah, I think similarly, the sort of developer technical contributions are a challenge. In a sense, they've always been a challenge with Fedora. Fedora is really kind of plumbing. I mean, it's the infrastructure that lays underneath Sambera and Islandora. And so most people, I think, would prefer to just work higher in the stack. They prefer to work, the interface level, and don't really want to get down to the working on the kind of Java project that underlies the other systems that they're working on. And so that's always been a challenge. I think we're addressing that in a few ways. One is to just have less software to maintain. So we're really focused on the API level and using commodity software underneath those APIs that we don't have to kind of own and maintain ourselves. So that's been kind of a part of it, is just sort of trying to make Fedora as easy to maintain as possible, so that it kind of allows people to contribute at different levels of the stack. But we still do need a certain level of continuous contributions at the Fedora level, so that does continue to be a challenge.
Yes, I think the biggest challenges facing ePrint. The first one that springs to mind, maybe there'll be many, is similar to the others. It's about sort of harnessing the community of developers, I think. So we have a lot of people who are very passionate about ePrint and want to contribute. But over the years, ePrint, I think, has become a little bit unwieldy with the sort of the contributions that are out there. So we've got for our GitHub repository, for example, we have numerous different branches and issues and things, and I think sort of getting a handle on that is quite important for keeping the community engaged and interested and supportive. So I think that's quite a big issue. There's also, I guess, a matter of emerging into new markets, as it were. So I mentioned flavors earlier. Some of those are actually, I think, going beyond our traditional comfort zone of open access publishing, for example. So there's definitely an element of exciting challenges there. And from a personal perspective, there's the user interface for ePrint, which I think always can be improved upon. However, at the same time, we've got to consider the fact that ePrint is designed to be deployed in different institutional contexts. So often you have to be able to transform an ePrint repository to look like an institutional website. So I think there's challenges there to make it perhaps more a modern feeling for users of the web in this day and age, but at the same time keeping it nice and flexible and simple so that it can be used in different contexts.
And I kind of alluded to this, I think, on the DSpace side of things. Like everybody else, we struggle with resources, although our resources, we get a lot of good development resources and stuff that's pushed our way from the community and from our service providers, but we are really lacking in terms of like coordination resources. We don't, and the funding to pay for the coordination resources. So I'm literally about a little around 50-ish% on DSpace, and I'm the only one that's like even that. We don't even have a full-time person on DSpace coordination-wise. So that's kind of our biggest gap. We still get a lot done without that because we have great service providers, we have great volunteers in the community helping make things happen. But I think that's our biggest challenge, and we're working. And the other challenge in parallel to that is working to move everybody to a single user interface, that Angular user interface. For so long, we've had two user interfaces working against one another, splitting our community for such a long time, and it's trying to bring our resources now together under one umbrella and move forward much more rapidly together rather than sort of separately. And it simplifies our code base, sort of what the Fedora model of trying to get a little bit less code to work with. So.
Any other questions? It's right there in the middle.
So from an implementer point of view, the eternal dilemma seems to be, wait until this great new version or implement the existing version. I'd just be interested to know how you guys, support the community to sort of come along with particularly when there are big changes that are coming.
I guess I can start here. So from the DSpace side of things, it's always been a challenge to keep people up to date and help people upgrade. We've tried to ease that challenge as we've gone and allowing the data to move a little bit more forward more easily in newer versions. And so you can actually now upgrade from DSpace 1.0 technically all the way up to DSpace 6, at least your data. Your user interface is not going to update automatically in that way, but the data itself can auto-upgrade itself at this point in time, and that's something we've worked towards. I will say another thing that we had to establish relatively early on when I got started with DuraSpace was a support model in terms of how many back releases we will support. That's become a challenge over time, but it's something that we're trying to work through. So we support the last 3 major versions, and we have that promise of making sure that, so right now we have DSpace 6.0 as the latest. We support anything on the 5 branches, DSpace 5 and DSpace 4, so those 3. That doesn't necessarily mean that we provide bug fixes to everything, but we backport things like security fixes or really important bug fixes. So we try and make sure that as long as you're somewhat recent, you'll be good to go. So it's just a couple things that we do.
Yes, I think as far as supporting for new versions and whatnot goes on, the first thing that springs to mind is the obvious answer is you could just become a paying customer, for example, and we'll just do it all for you. But I appreciate that's not always a sensible option. I think we also provide a certain amount of support, both ourselves and ePrint services, but also the community generally, on our wiki. So we have a wiki where people document problems and solutions that they come across. And I think that the bazaar I mentioned earlier is also a good answer for this, because it's a case of you've implemented the existing version and new things come along, but you don't necessarily need to upgrade to a whole new version. You can just install relevant updates for you from the bazaar. So I think there's an element of you don't always need to be up to date necessarily to have the latest features. And so obviously, the general sort of maintenance and bug fixes and stuff that will need to be applied to your repository. Trying to keep the upgrading process as simple as possible. And just ask questions of the community, I think, is a good thing. And someone will get back to you somewhere.
So for smaller kind of breaking changes between releases where there's kind of an update to existing resources required, we're always careful to release an update utility with the release that we put out. So we don't kind of leave people hanging and say, go figure it out. We put out the release with a utility to do that work of upgrading the resources. For larger breaking changes, we recently, within the last few years, moved from Fedora 3 to 4, which was a very big change. And that there are some tools that have been developed by community members to assist with the migration process, but a lot of that is institutions took the time to think about converting XML metadata to RDF, for example, and updating their data models, and that really is just kind of a commitment of resources at the institutional level that we try to support within the community through the mailing lists and through the training workshops that we put on and those sorts of events. But some of it is just kind of a commitment of resources that takes time. But one thing that we've done, kind of thinking about how we're going to handle this in the future, is to work on an import-export utility that has a number of use cases, but one of them is being able to export data from an existing Fedora repository and then import that data to a newer version of a Fedora repository. And that, I think, shows a lot of promise for future kind of breaking changes to make it easier for people to kind of just get an export of all of the data in a standardized RDF format and then put that into a newer version of Fedora that might be available.
So for Samvera, this has been a real challenge, and I think for all of the projects, because those who are putting development effort into the new branches don't tend to be greatly oriented to doing support for other people who have different problems. I think there are 3 ways that we've really focused on doing that. One, as I mentioned, we're a gregarious bunch, and it turns out there are a lot of people, no matter where you are in terms of the maturity of your stack, there are other people there. And I think there are 2 and about to be a 3rd migration interest group spinning up within the Samvera list. So people trying to figure out how to get from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4, for example, has been a sea change, not only in the underlying repository, but how you think about your data. So there's an active group there. The second thing that we're really looking at is moving from the application framework to more of a solution bundle. So 3 of the top 5 priorities for Hydra in a Box and Haiku were easy to maintain, and easy to maintain. The other 2 were easy to install and have good features. But those were the 3 because we realized that especially for people currently in the community was an issue for the kinds of people that we were trying to attract into Samvera. We knew it was going to be even more of an issue because they'd have fewer development resources. I think the third area where we really tried to put a premium is really trying to reshape the development cycle to have maybe 1 major release or 1 to 2 major releases a year and go through more of a structure so we can get things like migration utilities, do things like documentation, and really make it easier to manage the software over time, which for a lot of people in the community, that's really the main thrust. It's less so a brand new repository with new features, and it's more, how do I keep this going while I'm still spinning a bunch of other plates?
I think we found for us that we just have to let it be a gradual process. Like, we can't drive our community to adopt next major version. We have to follow their lead on where they want to be. And we've been through this in a smaller scale before, moving from major versions of Drupal 6 to 7 a few years back. And what we find is the institutions that have the motivation to get all the bells and whistles in the new version and the resources to do so end up being our early adopters, and they kind of blaze a trail and build the tools and the paths and the bridges that institutions with fewer resources can then follow along a few years down the road when they're ready to make that move and don't have to take on quite such a burden. And that's kind of where we're looking for things to go in the future with moving from Islandora 7 to Islandora Claw. We know not everyone is going to be able to move at the same time, so we're going to support them side by side until most of our community is off of one and onto the other, and we just have to follow their lead.
Other questions? Anyone? Yep, one in the back there.
So I hope I will express myself clearly, but I think most of the solutions presented here and most of the changes were really technical ones in the, I would say, last couple of months, at least years. They have taken a lot of resources, so it was transition to newer versions, newer technologies. But what about like features that are not really technical ones? So where are the repositories heading from the point of view of these kind of technicalities? Because this makes a lot of burden. I know that many of those changes were really necessary, but they haven't really brought anything to the community from the non-technical feature point of view. So what are the features you would like to have in the next couple of months, maybe years, that you really think are lacking and are not touching the just technicalities, APIs and these kind of things?
Well, I think for us, it's not specific features so much as we're moving to make Drupal more integrated into it. Drupal's an open content management system that's very popular in libraries. It's fairly user-friendly. It's got a huge support community. And it's got a lot of resources out there that we can take advantage of by making that a more integrated front end. And then you get lots of neat modules and non-technical things that people can put in their sites just by taking advantage of what the Drupal community has to offer. So that's our big user interface feature, is we're going to let you use Drupal to access your Fedora content almost natively.
I think there's a couple of very specific features that I'm thinking specifically around Haiku, which shares a lot of desires with other parts of the Hydra community. More content types, richer and more flexible mediated workflow so you can configure who sees what, who approves what gets released and how. And I think there's a lot of activity around bulk updates, bulk operations that's very attractive. And that's really trying to span an institutional repository and a set of use cases as well as digital collections, where we're trying to address both use cases in the same platform. I think my actual answer, but I think you said don't say API, is more APIs. And a big part of that is, I think, from my view, the future of the repository isn't cramming more features and content in, but it's more connections to systems that are outside the repository. So the ability to plop an entire object in or syndicate it out through ResourceSync or IIIF, or to integrate with a research data management system, I think that's where we need to be going. And I think Samver in particular, maybe our peer platforms, there's a lot of work to do there. I think we're still thinking of ourselves more as a stack, a monolithic stack, than we should be.
Yeah, and along those lines, I think that's very much where Fedora wants to be and where it's currently going now. One of the things we talked about at our workshop earlier this week was an API extension architecture, and that's something that there's a presentation on it in the Fedora Interest Group track this week, but this is sort of a way to kind of extend and add new features and services to plug into Fedora to do a lot of really interesting things. You know, the core of Fedora is not really going to get any bigger. It's designed to be very small and constrained to provide a limited set of features, but to have many different integration points and ways of integrating with other systems and services. So the OSF that I mentioned was a part of that, and being able to add new services in kind of very standardized ways, I think is a big part of what we're trying to do, along with just making data really easy to get into and out of the system. So, you know, as that kind of infrastructure piece, Fedora is less about user-facing features and more about being able to enable other kind of integrations with the core software and easing the burden on that side of things.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And so most of my sort of day job, I guess, is spent actually working on ePrints, but emailing repository administrators who have various different requests and different things that they want doing to the repositories. And these are non-technical sort of requests, I guess. And so one of the things that I find that people talk to me most about is just being able to report on the content that is in the repository. So frequently, people are always being requested by their bosses or sort of higher-ups. They just want to be able to interrogate the records in the repository more in different ways. So something that I've been working on recently, I mean, I guess it doesn't sound too exciting, but it's this idea that you can report and validate records in different ways. So the reporting framework that I've been working on is this idea that actually just sort of color coding records based on different ways in which they meet the REF requirements, which is this research assessment exercise in the UK. That's of huge importance to our UK users, and I've spent the last year working on various sort of policy requirements for that and sort of helping repositories get through that. So a lot of it is based on reporting, and I think also I've come across various things of people want more flexible ways of presenting the records in the repository. So something that I've worked on a bit myself is overlay journals that exist within a repository. I think that's quite an interesting non-technical sort of thing for maybe changing this landscape a little bit. This notion that you could create a virtual journal over the repository based on particular records that meet criteria. I think maybe that ties in a little bit to what Tim Figgaz was saying earlier. And yeah, also I was a PhD student before I started working for ePrint, so I have experience using it as an actual system for depositing records, and I agree with the others here that it's easier ways of just depositing records, so that as a user you have to interact with the repository as low as possible, because there's so many different systems now that want the same data, and so I think if you can just if it's all enter into one place and it fills in everywhere else, and that's excellent. I think ORCID is probably going to be quite important for that, because then you don't even have to necessarily do anything at all. If the publishers talk to ORCID and then ORCID talks to the repository, then you've got that flow right from the publication all the way through to your repository, and so everyone's happy and no one's really had to do an awful lot of work, and the publishers maybe have added a little bit of value, which I think is maybe it's good. Because there's certainly been some criticism on today that I can get on board with. But anyway, I think that's I think there's a lot of areas to explore still.
So I think there's a lot of commonality here, and I think what everybody is wanting to achieve. I think on the DSpace side of things, our biggest challenge towards even getting new features in for so long has been our two user interfaces, which has really caused it to be a pain to maintain any feature in either one of them and try and keep them in sync. And so in the last couple years before leading up to this Angular user interface stuff, that became the reason why we prioritized that we really just we need some new platform here. We need a new REST API. We need a new Angular user interface to move everybody towards, so we can move towards features much more rapidly and together in unison. The new REST API, in the opinion of the steering group as well, was really a way to provide more opportunities for integration, like both Tom and David mentioned, in terms of building more robust APIs and allowing you to integrate more easily. That's not to say that there won't be new features coming quickly, because there's a lot of interest in a detailed roadmap of things like IIIF integration actually as well. There's folks wanting to move that forward rapidly, and it's happening right now in a little like ad hoc working group on the DSpace side of things. With the Angular user interface efforts, there's going to be more moving things to the user interface more than having to config things on the back end, so more configuration in the user interface, customization in the user interface level, stuff of that nature. And there's things that we are prioritizing in terms of trying to enhance the metadata model and the content models of DSpace as we go. Those will probably be after the Angular user interface happens, but they are listed on our roadmap as priorities that we need to tackle and help modernize the platform. So it's just a couple ideas, but I think there's a lot of commonality here in all the platforms.
So we probably have time for one more quick question. We have about 3 minutes before lunch. Any other questions? Okay.
I have one. This is an easy question. You can answer it in one word. So I'm hearing that the technologies and architectures and needs of your communities are actually quite shared, and lack of resources is a common problem. Do you think that we have enough resources in the repository community to continue to sustain all these different open source solutions?
That's a loaded question.
Wait to end the session on the bang there.
I would have to say, I actually don't know, because I feel like there's a lot of groups that have not gotten engaged enough, to be honest. So I can't. I think it's a loaded question that I feel like I want to say no, because we were all resource strapped, but I think there's a lot of folks that haven't established repositories yet that we really can try and pull in and grab more resources for. But there is probably a lot of opportunities here to start to work closer together and collaborate more and allow data at least to flow between all of our systems. So that was more than one word.
Yes, for one word answer, I would say yes. I think there is enough. I think as repositories become more competitive, perhaps, no doubt. Actually, no, that doesn't really make sense. Yes, I think there are. I think it's just about more efficiently exploiting the communities that are keen to help. Exploiting sounds wrong, doesn't it? More efficiently encouraging and supporting their contributions, I think, is a very important aspect of that. I'll pass this on.
Yeah, I think this is a big challenge right now, and I think on the Fedora side, I mentioned this earlier, but we kind of recognize that there aren't enough people in the community that are really interested in working on Fedora all the time, at the same level that they're going to contribute to some of these higher level applications. And so a big focus for us has been, getting the focus to the API, having sort of underlying commodity software that we don't have to maintain, just shrinking the amount of code and things that we need to worry about and that we need to ask people to contribute to. Which isn't to say that we just can stop having contributors, but we may be able to get to a point where we need fewer contributors to maintain the software. And I think that's sort of where we're focusing, just recognizing that, it is a small community.
So my one-word answer is Highlandora. Where somewhat seriously, I think 5 years ago, members of Hydra and the Islandora communities really spent a lot of time looking at interoperability, and we made some good progress. And there are still some legacies of that with things like PCDM and shared participation in interest groups. But the technical gaps and some of the social gaps, even though it's very similar to DNA, were tremendous. And trying to converge everyone, I think, is probably a pipe dream. It's easier to start something new and move people to that than to do conversion. I think the relative answer is we have enough resources within this community until an external force comes in and represents maybe more of a looming threat. So if a commercial provider comes in that has different interests or different assumptions that aren't necessarily our needs, I think we'll have the answer to your question. Do we consolidate then, or are we in a good position to participate? I don't see anyone currently. There are a couple of people or projects that are doing really great work, but I don't see anything that looks like it's about to clobber the projects represented by this panel. I hope that's not like a foresight.
Yeah.
I'm not going to end this panel by being the one who says no. So, yes, I do. I think we've got a lot of commonalities, but we are serving different interests in different niches, and there's room for that. I think there's also, we can and should share more resources where that works, like with Samvera and Islandora. Things like the migration from Fedora 3 to Fedora 4, that's a big challenge for us, but it's not just our challenge. It's Fedora's challenge and Samvera's challenge, and we can pool a lot of our resources and take advantage of the fact that there are multiple options there, that we're all trying to solve the same things together and actually solve them together instead of side by side.
All right, well, yep.
I guess there may also be an opportunity to bring in resources from other domains, essentially. You see how repository technologies can be applied and essentially marketed outside of academia necessarily. I think there's always a chance for tapping into other resources elsewhere.
All right, well, that's a time. So please thank our panelists. And thank you all. I'm going to break for lunch.